My name is Mirka Balharova. I'm originally from Slovakia, but I'm currently based in London, where I work as an international tax advisor in private sector. Together with Dr. Mosquera, who's an associate professor at Leiden University, we wrote a chapter on tax incentives in developing countries. And more specifically, we dealt with a case study of Singapore and the Philippines. The aim of the chapter was twofold. Firstly, it was to analyze the tax incentives in developing countries and assess how effective they are in attracting foreign direct investment to the region. The second aim of the chapter was to analyze tax incentives that were granted in Singapore and the Philippines and evaluate them in light of new proposed evaluative framework and taking into account the Sustainable Development Goals. So in order to link the Sustainable Development Goals to the analysis of tax incentives, we argued that we should consider, first of all, efficiency of tax incentives, so their cost in terms of tax revenue, but also effectiveness in terms of achieving their goals, so social and economic growth. The Sustainable Development Goals relevant to this topic were achieving decent work, achieving economic growth, eradication of poverty, and building a resilient infrastructure. So I think it is crucial to distinguish between the role that tax incentives play in developing countries and the role that they have in developed countries. While in developed countries, tax incentives are mainly used to promote export, research and development activities, and improve the overall standing of the local firms on global market, the situation for developing countries is very different. Tax incentives in developing countries are often aimed at attracting direct investment into a specific region of the country or a specific sector of the economy, and promoting the social and economic growth in the region there. From our research, it was clear that tax incentives and their effectiveness is linked to the investment climate, and more specifically, investors' confidence in revenue authorities. There are a couple of elements or a couple of considerations to be mentioned here. These are political stability, stability of fiscal policy, adequate infrastructure, and very important and effective, transparent and accountable public administration. Therefore, I think it has to be noted here that tax incentives cannot compensate for deficiencies in the design of the tax system or inadequate infrastructure, but rather they should be used as complementing features of an already existing investment climate. I think that when properly drafted and implemented, tax incentives can be effective in attracting investment. But as I mentioned, this has to be a way of complementing an already existing attractive investment climate rather than trying to correct deficiencies. And likewise, that when properly drafted and implemented, they can be very useful in achieving social and economic growth in the country. The evaluative framework that the chapter discusses takes into consideration not only the administrative part and the legal drafting of the tax incentives, but also links them to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think there are a couple of key points to be taken from that. It is important to keep in mind that tax incentives need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. However, there are certain elements that can be considered in all instances. And that is that in order to implement tax incentives that work, there are a couple of elements required, including systematic evaluation of tax incentives. There need to be clear target and eligibility criteria. Furthermore, tax incentives need to be transparent, and there should be no discretion in the process of granting them. And lastly, there should be a fiscal budget linked to the tax incentives, and perhaps even a ceiling, a budget ceiling. And when this ceiling is reached, tax incentives should be terminated. I think there is still scope for work to be done on international level. We should therefore be promoting regional cooperation, because regional cooperation among countries can help mitigate any negative spillovers from tax competition on that level.